Hey guys, it's Megan and I'm back for another furniture flip. I got this cute little table at my local thrift store. I just love anything with caning, so I snatched this little guy right up. And it was in pretty good condition, just some cosmetic work that was needed. So I can't wait to show you how I flipped it. If you're not already, go ahead over to Instagram and TikTok and follow me there for all my latest tips, tricks, and flips. Let's get started. First step is the most important, and that is cleaning the piece. I grabbed my Dixiebelle White Lightning, which I have pre-mixed in a water bottle, as well as a plain water bottle sprayer, and I sprayed the White Lightning right on it, cleaned it up. It wasn't too dirty, just a little dusty, and then I wipe it down with regular water as well. Then I had to grab some clamps and some wood glue because this piece had some of the wood that was popping up on the top. So I grabbed these little syringes. You can get them on Amazon. They're great. They're teeny and they're perfect for getting in these little crevices that needed to be glued back together. You just glue it in and go ahead and clamp it and let it dry, and then you are good to go. I love these little tools. Great furniture hack. Next, I had to fill a few just little cracks and nicks in the wood, and so I grabbed my Dixiebelle Mud in brown, and I just used my finger to apply this, and I just move it over those places that need to be filled. It's better to over apply than under apply, and I let it dry usually overnight, and then I go back and sand it. Sometimes I have to reapply if a divot is particularly deep. And yeah, then just sand it and you're ready to go for the next step. Make sure you clean it off really well after you sand it before you move on to your primer. Next, I wanted to add just a little detail to this piece. This piece is kind of flat, basic, so I wanted to add something that would give it a little pop, give it a little dimension. And so I grabbed some molds, resin molds that I made myself, and I will do a video on that later to show you how that is done if you want to see it. And you just make the molds, and I sand the back of them a little bit to give it something to adhere to, and then you glue them on with wood glue. And I like to tape mine on with some painter's tape and let it dry overnight, and then you can prime right over them. Next, I wanted to protect the caning because I'm going to be leaving that natural, so I put pieces of paper and painter's tape and just completely covered it. I tried to slide in pieces of paper in between the wood and the caning where I could because that gives a nice, neat line, a lot of protection to the caning, but on the front that wasn't exactly possible, so I had to use painter's tape mostly around that to protect the caning. Next, it was time to prime my piece. I prime all of my pieces, gives a good adherence for the paint, and make sure there's no bleed through from the tannins in the wood into your paint. So I used Dixiebelle's Boss in clear, and with this, just make sure that you stir it up really well, not shake it, stir it. There's a lot of sediment on the bottom. You want to make sure it gets mixed in. And I went ahead and completely covered the whole piece in 2 coats of Boss primer and let that dry overnight before I went on to painting the piece. Next, I grabbed my paint color for this piece. I chose Spanish Moss by Dixiebelle, and I grabbed my mister to help thin the paint as I use it, and a large brush and then an artist brush to get around those caning areas, the framing. And I went ahead and did 1 full coat on the whole piece. I had to use my mister more than I usually do for a first coat because I haven't used this paint in a little while, and so it was kind of thick. And the mister just helps thins it out and gets a nice even coat on there. I did 1 coat over the whole piece. I wasn't too worried about coverage because I am going to be adding another layer with texture next. And here's what it looks like with 1 coat over the whole piece. I love Spanish Moss. It's such a pretty kind of vintage green sage color. The next step is my favorite step in this whole process, and that's adding texture. I use Dixiebelle's Sea Spray, and I combine it with the same base color, Spanish Moss. I mix it in a plastic cup with plastic spoon so I can easily throw it away, because you cannot put sea spray down the sink. So I added a couple spoonfuls of the Spanish moss, and again, this paint had been sitting for a while, so it was thicker than usual. That's why I added a little bit of water in there with my spray mister bottle. I don't usually do that when I'm mixing up textured paint, but this paint was super thick. So I mixed in a couple of spoonfuls, and then I added a little bit of the sea spray additive. And the way I do it is I just add a little bit at a time, and I mix until I get to a brownie batter-like consistency. This video is in collaboration with several other creatives who are also doing thrift flips this week. Go check out Savannah from Savvy Crafts with Savannah and Shayna from Robinson Repurposing. They are super creative, and so is everyone else on the playlist. Everyone is flipping items for $10 and under, and you're sure to get a lot of ideas, so go check them all out. Once I have the consistency right, then I grab a cheap brush. I use a chip brush, something I can easily throw away when I'm done, and I cover the piece in texture where I would like it. For this particular piece, I wanted there to be texture all over the entire piece, so I just pounced that texture all over, and I did one coat over the whole piece, and then I went back and did a second coat on certain areas where there needed to be more coverage. Once the whole piece was covered in texture, I took a fine grit sandpaper and I very lightly sanded over the piece. I don't want to sand that texture off. I just wanted to make sure there weren't any sharp pieces from any high points from the texture, and just kind of give it an overall smoother feel. Next, I wanted to cover up the screws that were holding this piece together. So I grabbed some wooden plugs and these furniture repair markers, both from Amazon. I chose the oak color because I wanted the plugs to mimic the caning as close as possible to match together. So I use these markers. I use these around my house to just fix up little nicks on the legs of chairs and things, and they work really well. And I used the oak one to color in and stain these wooden plugs. And these markers are very pigmented. They mimic wood stain extremely well. And I may have used an oak stain if I had had one on hand, but honestly, these work just as well. Then I used my syringe and put some wood glue in over the screws after I'd tightened them nicely, and I glued the plugs in and wiped off the excess wood glue, and it gave it a much more polished look. Then I carefully removed all the tape and the paper from around the caning, and I was so excited at this point because it's really starting to come together. You can see the caning next to the paint color, and I really think they complement each other well. Next, I wanted to jazz up the sides of the magazine rack, and so I chose this transfer from Redesign with Prima. It's the Floral Collection transfer, and it comes with a little burnishing tool, which is perfect. And I went ahead and cut out a couple pieces of this. I love this transfer because it's easy to cut up for smaller pieces like this. And I planned out exactly where I wanted the pieces, and then I take a little piece of paper. This is just a little trick I use, and I place it where I want my transfer to go so I can remember, and then I move it out of the way and place my transfer on top and smooth it out really nicely. One little tip is just make sure that your surface is extremely clean before you put the transfer on. That way you'll get the best adherence to the paint. Next, I burnish the transfer into the piece. And this definitely takes some muscle and it takes some time. It is worth it in the end, but just be patient with it. You apply a good amount of pressure throughout the whole piece, and then you slowly pull it back bit by bit. If you see that it's starting to pull, you just burnish some more. On these little transfers where there's thin stems and lots of edges, you just have to be more careful and patient with it. But it is definitely worth it in the end because it sure turns out beautiful. Once you're done, you can take a microfiber cloth or a pad and burnish the piece a little bit more just to make sure there's no air bubbles and those edges are adhered nicely. I decided that this piece needed a little something extra, so I added in a little butterfly that I had left over from another transfer. I think that turned out really cute, just really sweet, adds to the whole garden feel of this piece. I also did the other side and I added a little bird onto that side as well. Last is time to seal the piece and add just a little bit more texture and dimension at the end. I went ahead and grabbed my clear wax by Dixiebelle and a wax brush, and a little goes a long way with this. You just put a little on your brush and rub it in. I use circular motions and really work it into the paint. You want it to seep down into that paint and seal it up. So you rub it in and then you leave it for about 15 minutes. Once you've let it sit and soak in, then I take a microfiber cloth or pad and I buff any of the extra out. I take off the extra and I buff it, and it leaves you with a nice sheen and a nice smooth texture. Then I grab some dusting wax in brown and another wax brush, and I rub the brown wax into the resin mold and any crevices and places that age and dirt would naturally gather. I want to give this an aged look, and I want the wax to kind of highlight some of that texture that I put into the piece. So I put a lot of wax on. I use an artist brush as well if I need to, and then I can go back and just rub it off. If you got too much in an area, you can use your clear wax and that'll erase it back off. And this just gives it a really nice aged look. Lastly, I use Dixiebelle's Dixie Dirt, and this does exactly what it sounds like. It adds a little bit of dirt and grit to your piece, and it cures with the wax. So you want to make sure that you have wax on first, and then I used an artist brush and I just dust it into the places that I want to look a little more aged and a little more defined, into the corners around the resin mold. I love this stuff. This is newer to me and I am totally loving it and using it on all my pieces recently. The very last step that I did on this table is I added a clear coat on the very top of the table. Because this is a tabletop, the top of it will be getting a little more use, so I wanted to have a little more durability. And so after the wax has cured for about 72 hours or more, then you can add another water-based top coat on top of it, and I chose to use Dixiebelle's Flat to go on top of the table. And here is the final product. Look at this pretty little piece. I just think this table is the perfect piece to have next to your chair. Put your cup of tea and your book on, a couple magazines in it. It's just a beautiful statement piece. I love all the texture and the age. I just think this piece looks like it jumped right out of the garden and into my home. I love it. Thank you so much for watching. Stop by in the comments and let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.